welcome to the PI Podcast. I'm your host, Matt, and with me is my co host, political scientist, meme lord, and inflatable rescue Marxist, Borge.
What the hell? Okay. Since we just came out of a typhoon. Okay, that
Yes.
will be fucking entertaining.
All you need is just to blow, and he'll give you Marxist analysis.
he,
Yeah,
he
in a
will
time of a
rescue.
storm.
PI nyo, PI nating lahat. Board here at your service. The hell?
Yeah. So I hope you're doing fine after the typhoon, actually. So yeah,
Yeah.
still spouting Marxism in the storm. Anyway, that's from the Red Cross, by the way, issued. All right, so just a minor announcement, and okay, we discussed this for quite a bit of a. Uh, there's been a bit of a misunderstanding and controversy. We've received some concerns regarding label ourselves as scholars. If you see our pages, we describe ourselves as scholars, which we are. Like we read, we study, we produce scholarship, right? I presume you still do so.
Mhm.
Yeah. But instead, like in this society, scholars tend to be intellectuals that are it's an honor, a feather in your cap, So instead of, you know, rather than presume to be presumptuous, I think we are scholars, you and I. But instead of using we are now rebranding as research dudes and Polsci guys. Woo!
Yeah. Woo.
Yeah, I think research dude is your idea. Can you explain
Yep.
why research dude? My God.
It's just trying to deviate away from the usual highfalutin sense of being an academic. And just
Mhm.
just taking being an academic in a more relaxed fashion, which is something that is badly needed in the sector right now. Just
In
be a
other words,
dude.
this is our it's our idea of buddy Christ. It's like bring us to the 22nd century. We're research dudes. We're not uptight. We're cool. Or actually, I prefer Paul side guys just to highlight we're both in
Yeah,
political
fair.
science. We're cool, so we're like just the guys.
No,
We're just
we're doing
guys.
science in a cool fashion. Just do it.
Ooh, like science guys, or this is where Paul side guys. But you know what? Like research dude and Paul side guys sounds like mermaid man and barnacle boy. So I don't know. But if you have any ideas about that, like maybe drop the Paul side guy or whatever, or change it to research dude or whatever, let us know in your comments. So yeah, that's our new
Yeah.
rebranding. We're
Yeah.
rebranding,
A
or
bit.
or said we're just PI. Yeah,
PI
or
pa
can
rin.
be PIs. Mga PI lang tayo, di ba? Okay. All right, so there's that. Anything to add on that, or like?
Nah, nothing. That would be
All
fine.
right, all right. But speaking of words and baggage, our word for this episode is quite well. It's kind of contentious, and it's a product of debate. And a lot of people and their mom have been
Mm.
publishing, writing, filming their own reactions to this. It's resilience.
Mm.
Resilience, particularly after three massive storms,
Typhoons, yep.
particularly, yeah, typhoons here in the Philippines. See, the Philippines normally has around at least 20 typhoons, five of them being deadly, but the three of them,
Mm.
Rolly, and I forgot the other one, and then Ulysses,
Mm.
such cultured names we have for them. And so, yeah, and particularly the last one, Ulysses, like really like flooded
Mm.
like the Rizal and Antipolo and Marikina in particular.
Mm.
So yeah, resilience. What do you think about that? The way people are talking about it
Okay.
right now.
Okay. The
Mhm.
thing is, for the longest time, resilience has never been contested. I think for the longest time,
Mhm.
it's one of our hallmarks in trying to be part of the global community that the Filipinos are the most resilient and one of the most happy societies. So it's a
Mhm.
surprise for me to find the word itself under contestation right now
Mhm.
for valid reasons to an extent, but also, well, again, it's shaking up foundations of our shared consciousness, really.
Mhm.
So it's
Right.
like pulling on a loose string right now. It's like pulling on a loose
Mm.
string. Things could unravel.
Mhm.
So that's something that we can do today, tonight
Right.
for our
Mm.
session.
Yeah, because if you remember, like resilience of the Filipino, yeah,
Mm.
it's been a long time topic of discussion in
Yeah,
media, although it's not contested, as you said.
yeah, it's not
And
contested.
even remember, I think it was Anderson Cooper, like a
Mm.
prominent CNN anchor, reporter, came to the Philippines, and he was touched and reduced to tears when he saw that
Mm.
the Filipinos were still, still smiling and
Yep.
rebuilding. They're not like wrecks. They're not
Mm.
psychologically traumatized. Just bounce back, and that's the point of resilience. You're able to bounce back.
Mm.
But now it's not even like an intellectual argument. It's more like some of the first people who say it were like Slater Young. He's used the former Pinoy Big Brother
Mm.
contestant, now celebrity architect.
Mm.
I think he's an architect. Said that stop romanticizing resilience
Mm.
because it is the how you say a way of patronizing and
Mm.
also ignoring accountability or the failure
Mm.
of the government
Mm.
for responding properly into these things. And if you see people, well, you see
Mm.
what in social media, like what do you see? What kind of pictures do you see about resilience when you,
Okay, that one.
uh, yeah,
Yeah,
see in social media?
yeah, for the
Mhm.
longest time, I think I can remember from Ondoy, Bagyong
Mhm.
Ondoy, way back in 2008, I think, 2008 or
Right.
2006, 2009. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's resilience is usually tied with pictures of Filipinos still smiling in front of the camera, even if they're neck deep in flood.
Mhm.
So yeah, again, this culture of resilience and how we articulate it for the longest time is all about tying our capacity to smile in the face of disaster.
Mhm.
so
Yes.
so yeah, so that's basically the primary mode of expressing this one for the past few years.
And it's not just a fake smile, but actually
Mm.
being able to make jokes in
Mm.
disasters. Like if you see, in particular, there's this picture in social media of a guy watering his plants while it's pouring outside. So, wow. Or there's this group of people who are still, how you say,
Mm.
playing cards in the rain or in like waist deep in
having a
flood water, which is
having a drinking
gross. Yeah.
session having a drinking session in
Yeah,
flood water.
nagiinuman sila sa baha. Like ew. So that's like in the way that like you're not phased by it,
Mm.
So it's actually quite funny. It's also inspirational, but for other people, it's like it's kind of like when people are having a hard time. Like some people
Mm.
aren't as resilient. Like it's
Mm.
almost as like if they're able to laugh in this,
Mm.
it's almost they find it offensive. It's like, why are you laughing? Why are you making fun of this? This it can be in disease,
Mm.
leptospirosis,
Mm.
So yeah, so it's very not everyone finds it as a value the same
Mm.
as people used to. So yeah, so today we're going to discuss
Yep.
resilience.
Yep. Yep.
Is
Yep.
it a virtue or a vice? All right, let's get started. First of
Yep.
all, I think, well, what do you think resilience actually is? Like from the origin, like we
Okay.
applied it
Okay.
to Filipinos in disasters. What is resilience really?
Okay. Okay. Just a bit of etymology for resilience. Again, the word resilience, well, came from the Latin resilire. Resilire. Yeah.
Resiliere.
Yeah. Resilire, which is, again, as you said a while ago, which is to bounce back. So that's
Mm-hmm.
basically an attribute wherein the object has capacity to bounce back. And when I say object, I'm also alluding to the fact that the first time it was used in the English language, the English tongue, resilience was used to examine inanimate objects. That's one
Mm-hmm.
thing. It's used to examine things, especially
Mm-hmm.
by Francis Bacon, Renaissance
Mm-hmm.
scientist and philosopher. So he examined the capacity of objects to bounce back or to again regain its attributes despite of pressure, despite
Mm-hmm.
of increased pressure. So that's one thing. So
Mm-hmm.
again, we need to take that into account that it was applied to inanimate objects. But I think it was
Mm-hmm.
applied first to human beings when psychology started gaining more ground, collective psychology to be
Mm-hmm.
more specific. So human
Mm-hmm.
beings became the object, but not necessarily
Right.
inanimate. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the root of it.
Mm-hmm. Uh, so the thing is, like some people are considered as rocks when they're really resilient, like
Hmm.
or when someone is a source of resiliency, like
Hmm.
you're called like or your other half, your spouse
Hmm.
say you're my rock, something like that. So it's a
Hmm.
metaphor. Primarily, important thing that you said was it's a psychological attribute, and if you try to search on YouTube resilience, there are a lot of TED talks on how to be
Hmm.
resilient. It's basically like getting perspective, knowing that
Hmm.
you'll be able. There's a tomorrow, there's hope, etc. But the thing is, and I want, for moving from that,
Hmm.
a psychological attribute
Mm.
normally for objects.
Mm.
Uh, moving into it's actually a cultural trait. And when we say
Mm.
cultural, it is this quote unquote psychological profile being
Mm.
shared by a society.
Mm.
And the problem with like a culture is like normally with people like as a community collectively are
Mm.
able to bounce back, not just one person or a
Mm.
family, but a town or community,
Mm.
which means that if you fall short of that cultural resilience,
Mm.
then that means you'll be either ostracized or
Mm.
criticized. In other words, you call it like arte mo. Oh, kaya mo yan. Or it's like, oh, di mo kaya yan, grabe.
Yeah.
Parang hindi ka Filipino. Like, you're not.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So you think about that.
No. No.
What do you
No.
think about it as a cultural? Yeah,
Regarding that
it's a
one,
cultural attribute.
regarding that one,
Mhm.
2 points. Well, I think I need to further clarify this one. Again, it's something
Right.
applied to inanimate objects. Resilience
Mm-hmm.
as a virtue, to an extent, was not really called resilience. I mean, I'm familiar with
Mm.
Stoic writings. Stoic writings can be understood as advocating resilience, but Stoics do not use the word resilience.
Right.
They use other virtues like
Uh.
prudence or living in the
Mm.
present. So these are more specific, more human virtues, but not. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think they called it resilience as far as the Stoic writings are
Right.
concerned.
This, mm.
Yeah, we must be aware that we must be clear that the word resilience, it became a virtue when we started considering other human beings as objects of our analysis.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it became a virtue. So that's one thing. Now
Mm-hmm.
regarding culture, again, it's about bouncing back. We need to
Mm-hmm.
emphasize that one. When you say bouncing back, it doesn't mean moving forward,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that is where the problem comes in. It can lead
Mm-hmm.
to stagnation. Resilience
Mm.
can be a slippery slope to stagnation. You just keep on bouncing back.
Right.
Mm.
The thing is, if we can, well, we moved on from like Stoic writings or the
Mm.
Greek and Romans.
Mm.
I got to think about it. If resilience is a Filipino virtue, what do we call resilience in Filipino? I think I googled this. It's called katatagan. Yeah,
Katatagan,
but
which is
katatagan. Yeah,
mm,
and it's not commonly used. But you're right? Is that right? Is that the right word?
matatag. Yeah, matatag
Matatag.
is
Mm-hmm.
matatag. It's not resilience per se. It's more of again. It's also something you use for houses. Something you use for
Matatag
inanimate
yung
objects.
bahay.
Huh,
Yeah. But for para sa mga tao, like for
matibay.
people, matibay, puro matibay. By the way, that's an idea for my campaign as a senator if ever. It's like
Matibay.
matatag, mat,
Mat-
matibay, mats for
matigas.
senator, matigas. But yeah, it's for objects, not for people. So yeah,
Mm.
or as a verb to be resilient, parang to bounce back, it's called bumangon, and it's a more
Mm.
common word,
Mm.
kaya bumangon. Or if you
Pagbangon.
look at like if you look at TV commercials, you
Mm.
see for coffee commercials, babangon tayo,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
babangon. Yeah. Anyway, enough of that singing. But yeah, so come to think of it, when you say resilience, it's really it kind of reveals that it is a either foreign attribute
Mm.
to us,
Mm.
or it is actually a middle class like trait that again judgment put upon Filipinos, most
Mm.
especially the poorest of the poor, the hardest hit. So you think about it, it's like it's not
Mm.
like when people say, I have to be resilient, no one really
Mm.
says that. It has to be like, oh,
Mm.
that person is resilient.
Mm.
It's not really a conscious effort. It's like a to be resilient.
Mm.
It's just for them. It's just trying to survive. Number
Mm.
one, or it's not. I mean, it's not really
It
reflexive. What
is
do you think?
the
Yeah.
thing is resilience is something we apply to an entire set of actions.
Mm-hmm.
So in an entire set of behavior, a set of uh, psychological tendencies that we can call
Mm-hmm.
resilience. But
Right.
but you're right. You're right. When someone doesn't think about being resilient, someone just thinks of
Mm-hmm.
surviving, and that's a
Mm-hmm.
different thing. That's a different
Mm-hmm.
issue altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when you say bangon tayo, we need to stand back, we need to rebound, we need to bounce
Ooh.
back. Again,
Yeah.
let me re-emphasize, it's not about moving forward. So that's one thing. So there's a problem with that one. But
Mm-hmm.
what I want to raise and I think we are already gravitating around this one, is that resilience would mean different things for different people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing.
Mm.
Resilience would
Right.
mean different things from different people. What about you? When you see someone under crisis, how
Mm.
can you tell someone is being resilient?
Like, how can you tell when? Well, normally when someone is undergoing trauma, like
Mm,
the first thing to do is to cry or to
mm,
be in a fetal position.
mm,
Just being unable to move.
mm,
But for people that who are resilient, they just could, not only they can absorb the shock, but then again, it goes with like trying to move on, building back the house if it was flooded, or like
mm,
going back to normal.
mm,
So moving back to a sense of equilibrium, as what you mentioned, going back to where you started, but not like we said,
mm,
moving forward. But
mm.
you can actually say that you need to be resilient in order for you to do the next step, which is to move forward, to
Yeah,
adapt, to
yeah, yeah,
learn. So
yeah.
yeah.
And yeah,
Mm,
you're right, and that's something that, well, from the perspective of scholars, from the
mm,
from the perspective of the literature on resilience and disaster risk management, that is what
right.
that's what they took into account. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
for them, resilience or resilience governance. Oh God, we've been dealing with this one in one of our papers.
Right.
Resilience governance means not only the capacity to absorb shock of a certain crisis,
Mm,
but also the capacity to adapt to to
mm,
the movement of a certain situation. So they added a feature
mm-hmm.
which is already adaptation. Adaptation
Yeah.
is not necessarily resilience, but they place it underneath it. So yeah,
Mm.
that's the perspective of academics.
Right. I had a similar conversation with another group of friends,
Mm,
and they were like saying sports metaphor, like how boxers would tend to like learn to take hits. They would hit their abs
mm,
with a stick, pak, pak.
mm,
Like Manny Pacquiao,
mm,
like hit their head. But it's not enough to learn to take a hit, but you
mm,
have to learn to dodge.
mm.
In the Well, you have to do more than
Tolerance,
take a
pain
hit.
tolerance.
But kaya mo rin umilag, you have to know to
Mm,
dodge, at the same. So so again, it's part of a set of skills,
mm,
which is so yeah, it's only one of many. But at the same time, the problem with resilience, possibly being a virtue, like many virtues, or like the Aristotelian view
mm,
of virtue, is it's in a mean between two things. And when you say it's possible to be, you're too resilient, and
mm,
the thing that you can call someone in Filipino, if you're
mm,
quote unquote too resilient, is you know manhid. What's the
mm.
English term for manhid? Like you're
Insensitive,
indifferent,
indifferent.
insensitive, like you're cold, you're unfeeling, namanhid ka dahil sa
Numb.
because of resilience. You're
Mm.
numb because of resilience. You think it's possible with that resilience as a value?
Yeah, that's the thing.
You're, mm,
From an Aristotelian perspective, I don't think Aristotle would consider resilience as a virtue of
mm,
man. I think Aristotle would
okay,
consider resilience as a virtue for things. That
oh,
house is resilient.
okay, ah,
That building
okay.
is resilient. But that's the thing. Houses are supposed to be resilient. Buildings are
Mm-hmm,
supposed to resist pressure. Are humans
mm-hmm,
supposed to be like that as well? So that's a different thing.
mm-hmm. I suppose in a certain level of analysis, all human beings, in some sense, are objects in the universe. But again, they are, of course, sentient. And again, resilience is also a psychological trait. So it's their way of, again, taking the shock, but
Mm,
also, of course, gaining information, processing that information, and then like moving on with that new insight, and so as not to undergo it again. And the thing about like disasters in particular is
mm,
this is um how you say typhoons is a
mm,
common thing. 20, as I mentioned earlier, 20 typhoons.
mm,
Human beings as compared to objects is where we have the capacity to learn, and we can't learn politically or in policy
mm.
if we are overly resilient, or if we're only resilient and not adaptive. And in
Yeah.
fact, one thing I'd like to say before we move on is, besides of course, don't you think that it's possible that the resilience discourse
Mm,
can actually prevent one from empathizing with, say, less fortunate? Like, for instance, some people, even
mm,
not necessarily the middle class, some, because middle class might
mm,
be, might be using this same as well.
mm,
Like, kinaya natin to. We are able to
mm,
take it. What about you? Like, even the poor people to other poor people,
mm,
like saying, ah, kinaya naman natin yun eh. But kayo, oh, dapat ganyan, ganyan.
Hmm.
So instead of being there, comforting them,
Hmm.
being sensitive, you're
Hmm.
so cold and unfeeling and resilient
Hmm.
that you're unable to empathize. What do you think about that?
I think that's a possibility, but I think
Mm-hmm.
Filipinos also have a tendency to empathize and sympathize.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is quite. Hmm, is that possible for? We need data for that one. I would entertain the hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
We need data for that one. But I think, as far as my observation is concerned, it's not really a matter of empathizing because again, for the past
Mm-hmm.
few days, donation drives have been going on. Even I
Mm-hmm.
more or less joined some donation drives as well. You just try to help,
Ooh.
but it's not about that per se. My problem with it is that we may use the quote unquote resilience of
Mm-hmm.
others to boost our own morale without even knowing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And we must
Oh,
be
okay.
conscious of it. So again, when we use the term resilience,
Mm-hmm.
we are making others as objects for our own
Mm-hmm.
ends. We dub
Mm.
them as resilient. They need not dub
So,
themselves as resilient, but we do.
mm-hmm.
For what
Uh-huh.
end? To what end? So that's the question.
Or or foreigners actually objectify us as resilient. Like, oh wow,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
instead of like saying like, oh, poor people, and like saying, oh, look at them, they're so resilient, they can still smile. So in other words, it's they
Yeah.
see us as like this standard rather than
Mm.
people who suffered.
Mm.
Sometimes resilience can how you say shield suffering, which it's
Mm.
necessary sometimes, but at a certain point you need to hold people accountable. And so I think that's another thing that we have to move on to,
Mm.
which is resilience in a way as a political scapegoat, in
Mm.
governance. Particularly resilience became such a buzzword is that
Mm.
people like Slater Young and Nadine Lustre, like
Mm.
celebrities of all people, not political scholars, celebrities, were calling out particularly presidential spokesperson Harry Roque and president himself,
Mm.
when they said like when two instances. Number one, like half the country, 45% were
Mm.
unemployed. I think
Mm.
close to half the country were unemployed. So thank God they said thank God it's not 50, like it's not 100%.
Mm.
So people are still backing, like are still withstanding the economic tragedy.
Mm.
And the other one is this, like
Mm.
Duterte himself, like I want to swim with you, but
Mm.
that's I can't, but I know that we are able that we'll be able to bounce back to this. It's like,
Bullflag.
uh, yeah. But anyway, enough about Duterte. But that these are the fact that it's being used right now to
Mm.
justify political inaction or political
Mm.
incompetence is what's really the main issue here. So,
Mm.
what do you think about that? Like in terms of the resilience discourse in governance?
Okay, regarding that one, I think I already said something about that earlier. Resilience governance as a concept itself, but
Mm-hmm.
resilience in relation to accountability. So that's an
Mm-hmm.
issue. Resilience
Mm-hmm.
in relation to accountability. Should
Mm-hmm.
we actually pit one against the other?
Mm-hmm.
Are they
Why not both?
contradictory? Are they?
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. Are they contradictory? And if they are contradictory, in what sense?
Mm-hmm.
And in trying to answer these questions, I think we must be aware that, again, resilience is not adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
Resilience is different from prudence.
Mm-hmm.
Resilience is not vigilance. Resilience is
Mm-hmm.
simply bouncing back.
Mm-hmm.
The more
Right.
we, the more concepts we try to inflate it with, the more
Mm.
it becomes convoluted, loaded, basically useless as a concept. No, not
Mm.
really useless, but it becomes a mechanism for us it's more of a shorthand for also many things that we should just dissect.
Right. So it's a loaded term, and
Yeah.
but it becomes all of a sudden more than what it really is.
Mm.
Yeah, is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a value. It becomes a
Mm.
value. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the key thing about this problem. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
mere category. It is not a mere definition. It becomes a value. That's why
Mm-hmm.
it's now contested.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, regarding
And I think,
accountability.
yeah.
Yeah, what do you say about accountability?
Mm, the thing is accountability. You're right, and they're not necessarily
Mm.
mutually exclusive.
Mm,
But again, what I'm trying to say is like it's you need to be resilient in order to hold someone accountable, you know,
mm,
because again, without resilience and you've suffered a trauma, you'd simply you'd simply be on the floor, you know, defeated, you know.
mm,
So that's one thing you need, you know, you need resilience to take a hit, but at the same time, you also need accountability to throw a hit. You know, think of it this way. You know, politics has been used a lot, or like, or citizenship even, is in a way in a struggle or even in a fight
mm,
with your government when it needs to be held accountable. So
mm,
not only can you take hits, you
mm,
can take punches, but you can also throw them. You know,
mm,
and that's why some people find accountability to be that, you know, throwing
mm,
punches, punching up to whoever is whoever is should be held accountable. And perhaps we can move on a bit, like, because a lot of people can say that this storms, disasters, typhoons, they're acts of God, force majeure.
mm,
These are uncontrollable. But when you say accountability, you need to pinpoint the failures of like
mm,
agents. You know,
mm,
like in other words, people can be blamed because there's
mm.
failure. And would you aware of like human failure? Do you think this is an act of God, or like a calamity
Yeah,
that can't be avoided, or can it
yeah.
be avoided? And people need, well, heads need to roll,
Yeah,
you
that's
know,
one
because
thing.
people
Yeah,
failed. Yeah.
yeah. Resilience, how we define resilience, how we tackle resilience, how we understand and how we make resilience into a value really
Mm-hmm.
depends on the nature of the crisis that it is
Mm-hmm.
tied with. Because again,
Mm-hmm.
resilience is about bouncing back from pressure. So
Mm-hmm.
you need to have that pressure first to define what resilience is. Now, resilience can refer to, I think that's another thing. Resilience as a value in the Philippines is not only exclusive to disasters. That's
Mm-hmm.
one thing. I mean, if we are going to look at a different type of crisis, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically corruption, bad
Mm-hmm.
governance in general for the
Mm-hmm.
past few decades, and Filipinos not protesting against it
Mm-hmm.
for the longest time, we can call that resilience to an extent.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I would rather call it coping.
Mm-hmm.
So, but regarding the nature of the disaster itself, since your question is about is it a human failure or an act of God? Well, first and foremost, I don't believe that God can act anyway, so it is of course human failure.
Mhm.
But how is it?
Okay.
But how is it human failure? Well, again, is lack of adequate preparation,
Mm.
dysfunctions in the disaster risk management, the institutions
Mhm.
involved in it.
Mhm.
Eventually, afterwards, you have to dare to just creating task forces here and there, which is quite
Mhm.
stupid as far as I'm concerned.
Mhm.
You already
After
have
the
this,
fact, after
yeah,
everything is done, yeah.
yeah, and then you
Mhm.
have the bickering right now between him and the vice president. So it
Mhm.
is again, there's only so much that man can do to prepare, but one must prepare with all all the capabilities that he or she can do. So
To the fullest,
to
and
the fullest.
so you're saying that we've been less prepared than we should have been, yeah.
Yeah, we have been less prepared on one hand, and on the other hand, we have
Mhm.
been doing shit that had contributed to the disaster itself.
Mhm.
Bad urban
Let me just
planning.
mention a few
Yeah.
about even planning, yeah. A few of them would be: number one, the defunding of the project Noah, which is
Yeah.
supposed to help us. Number two, the closure of the suspension of the franchise of ABS-CBN for a lot
Mm,
of areas. They didn't know that the storm
mm,
was coming, and their
mm,
main lifeline was ABS-CBN because of petty partisan
mm.
politics. You know, it was closed down. Another one is
Deforestation.
deforestation, the fact that it can no longer absorb
Mm,
rainwater, and
mm,
so it simply just flowed into it. Or
mm.
the fact that they didn't like they it's something about the dams, like they didn't open did did they open the dams, or they did not open the
The
dams?
dams,
Something has to do with dams, yeah.
the dams, again, regarding dams and flooding, dams keep
Hmm.
water back,
Hmm.
but when it releases water, it aggravates a flood. So,
Right.
so
So
tied with deforestation, uh, soil can be easily saturated, dams can easily
hmm
overflow, and when dams
right.
overflow, they release water and aggravates the entire thing. So it's basically taking time bomb. So yeah.
hmm The thing is, another issue which is we might be beyond this, but really our attention to environmental and earth science. And
Hmm.
the thing is, where are the earth scientists? Like, why didn't we know about this? Like, to coordinate the management of the dam, the management of the forests, the management of seashores, etc. And apparently, people still live near the seashores.
I think
Um,
the thing is, they are powerless.
mm,
They are scientists are powerless here in the
mm,
Philippines. Simple
right.
as that. We're
Mm-hmm.
basically just we're basically powerless. So yeah.
Mm. Well, political scientist, so it's a scientist. And yeah, I think that's now more than ever. I think we need more like earth scientists, climate scientists to at least to be consulted
To
or to
be in
contribute
power.
to the to be in, to be in power to make policies to help prepare for this
Hmm.
now, like in the future, where
Hmm.
it's only going to get worse.
Yeah.
If climate change is a real thing,
Hmm.
we need to prepare for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So and that's another thing. We need science-based governance.
Yeah.
Um, and I
I think
suppose,
yeah. Yeah. Go
go
ahead. Go
ahead.
ahead.
I think I lost. I lost it. Yeah, I was talking about we need science-based
Hmm.
governance, and so I suppose one thing that we have to I think one of the last questions we have to do before we wrap this up is at the same time the role of resilience in quote unquote citizenship and governance. Wow, city golf now. So is
Hmm.
can it be quote unquote a citizen's virtue? Is it a quality for a citizen when performing his role in citizen in politics?
Yeah.
And how much of it can it be done in governance? And I think it's a specialized term, but I think you and I researched a bit, but it's not
Hmm.
enough. But what do you
Hmm.
think in these two dimensions? How can resilience contribute to the citizenship and governance?
Is resilience can resilience be a civic virtue? Can
Mm-hmm.
resilience be a civic virtue? Ah, this is one fucked up thing as far as I'm concerned. I would say no. It's not supposed to be a
Oh.
civic virtue. People should be pissed
Mm-hmm.
off. For the longest time, I have been looking at coping, and
Mm-hmm.
coping is my way of operationalizing resilience because
Mm-hmm.
I have no love lost for the notion of resilience ever since
Mm-hmm.
2010. Ever since for the longest time,
Mm-hmm.
I never liked the word resilience itself. Hence, then again, I know that the word itself is complicated. Hence, I looked into coping.
Mm-hmm.
So, should resilience be a civic virtue? No, God no. We should be pissed off.
All right. Mm. Okay. Well, before I move
Okay,
on to
okay,
governance,
okay.
yeah.
Regarding that one, I'll add one more
Uh
thing.
huh. Hmm.
Why shouldn't it be a virtue? Because virtue is supposed to lead to excellence.
Mm.
Filipinos know how to survive. We know how to
Hmm.
survive. We are
All right.
capable of surviving, and that's enough. No need to call it a
Mm-hmm.
virtue.
Mm.
Surviving is not a virtue because it's not excellence. It doesn't advance
Mm-hmm.
our society.
All right. Well, again, to a degree, like I said,
Hmm.
like it said, resilience can definitely lead to mediocrity and inaction and passivity. But the way I look at it is, especially in the citizen, is that certain virtues are like organs. They're interconnected with each other. You need
Hmm.
resilience again to hold
Hmm.
people accountable. You need resilience to you have to be observant to be resilient sometimes. You need to process information and then take it in, properly in
Hmm.
order to absorb the shock. Uh, but you cannot, how you say, again, simply just take it out. In other words, it's part of a system of virtues. I think even I'm not sure if this is exactly what Aristotle says, but all the virtues are interrelated to one another, like a system.
Hmm.
And you can't take away, for instance, courage and temperance and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
magnanimity. They're interrelated to one another. You need to be temperate in order to be magnanimous. You have to
Hmm.
control yourself. You have to be in order to be courageous. You need to be somewhat also sensitive at the
Hmm.
same time. So you won't be stupidly
Hmm.
courageous and just put yourself in danger.
Hmm.
So my view is that you need resilience, but you shouldn't stop there. It's a prerequisite for other virtues. You need to be resilient to withstand even defeat at the hands of your own government.
Hmm.
So I suppose my answer is yes. You need,
Uh, uh,
uh, but but you need resilience to an extent. but it cannot work alone,
Mm.
and it has to motivate action and adaptation. And these are two distinct things. You're right. Resilience is not adaptation, but it is, in a way, it's a prerequisite for adaptation. So that's my view there. In
Yeah,
regards to, yeah, okay, anything to
regarding that,
respond to that?
yeah, I think the thing is, again, let me re-emphasize, it is
Mm-hmm.
already natural.
Mm-hmm.
It is already natural for man to survive. The thing is,
Mm-hmm.
I reserve the again, as far as Aristotle is concerned, we
Mm-hmm.
reserve the notion of virtue to any attribute that would advance the polity.
Mm-hmm.
So I would
Mm-hmm.
agree. I would agree that resilience, if you would call it that, bouncing back is a
Mm-hmm.
prerequisite, but it doesn't advance. It is not
Mm-hmm.
meant to. It's not meant to advance. So it's basically,
Mm-hmm.
if it's a part of the body,
Mm-hmm.
should it even be
I
considered
think
as
it
a
would be
part of
the
the body?
abs.
What the hell?
Yeah, but it protects you. Definitely, it keeps. I mean, it's probably the skeleton.
Not the
It keeps you organized. I don't know. Yeah, keeps you form. I don't
toughness.
know.
Toughness
Yeah.
is, yeah. Toughness is okay. My response to your argument is that instead of looking at resilience as a virtue, why don't we dissect
Mm-hmm.
resilience itself and stop calling it
Mm-hmm.
resilience? Because you mentioned some things that
Mm-hmm.
can be labeled otherwise, like when you said that you need
Mm-hmm.
to have the capacity to absorb information, to process it in order to bounce back. That's prudence, and that's what we
Mm-hmm.
call awareness. That's conscientiousness. It's not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
resilience. Why call it
Right.
resilience?
Mm.
So I think we need to unpack it. We need to unpack it
Right.
because if we unpack it, we would be more aware of actual virtues that
Mm-hmm.
are that
True.
can advance our
Mm-hmm.
existence as a society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Interesting. Um, I think we can move on to our last question. I think, which
Mm,
is knowing this, knowing that resilience is something we can use, but it can also be a vice. It can be
mm,
uh, at the same time useless. It cannot advance us. So how do we move forward in this situation that it's questionable at the very least?
mm, mm.
What do you think?
How? I think you go first. You go first.
Uh-huh. Well, I think it's simple. Like, mm, perhaps you can simply be practice resilience and be resilient without necessarily talking about it,
Yeah.
because it right now it's used as a diversion from
Mm,
actual problems.
yeah.
So you don't, how you say, it does not, you use it, you
Mm,
keep it
mm,
as a virtue, you keep it, but it doesn't prevent you from holding
mm,
people accountable. It's
mm,
not mutually exclusive.
mm,
And I think you need to practice resilience, because
mm,
again, I think it is a quality that a lot of people envy us for.
mm,
In fact, a lot of people like in the West, they watch TED talks to be resilient, but for us, we
mm,
don't need the TED talks because we were able to smile despite being in waist deep in floods. So yeah, I suppose that's true. That's one. Number two, always follow through. And resiliency is an instinct, yes, for you to go back into an equilibrium of what you were before. But yeah, I agree with you. You have to move forward, and
mm,
part of moving forward is identifying the problems, holding people accountable,
mm,
renewing the system so we don't suffer again. So that's part of resilience. In a way, is part of our capacity to learn and to
mm.
adapt. You can't do it. You can't adapt without it. So yeah.
You
How about
can't?
you?
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
okay. You know what? I agree with most of what you said, but again,
Sure.
I have reservations of calling it a virtue, because calling it a
Mm-hmm.
virtue would bring it closer to romanticization, and that is already the
Mm-hmm.
problem. I don't think we should romanticize virtue, but we should practice it. And
Mm-hmm.
when I say we should, I'm being pretentious because we are
Mm-hmm.
already practicing it. I don't need to say that we should. We are already,
Right.
because that's part of human existence.
Mm-hmm.
We are by instinct capable of surviving. Why praise
Mm-hmm.
it? Why
Right.
praise an instinct? It's an instinct. It's supposed to be a raw material for a virtue.
Mm-hmm.
It's not virtue itself.
Mm.
It is
It's
not
almost
something.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a raw material. I mean, should I praise cement for more or less creating a good building? To an extent, yes, the quality of cement.
Yes. Yeah.
But
It's quality, man.
I don't put it above or at par with the building.
Hmm.
I don't. It's a raw material. I
Okay.
value it as a raw material, not virtue. So that's one thing.
Otherwise,
But
it's just yeah.
yeah,
It's just like patronizing or like tooting your own horn, like, oh,
yeah.
resilience. In fact, the fact some people like reduce it to a smile or even
Hmm,
making jokes,
hmm,
it's actually quite offensive to actual resilience, you know. So
yeah,
I think we should praise resilience when it deserves praise, not in its simplest of
hmm,
manifestations, but in its extreme manifestations,
hmm,
like being able to like being able to move despite losing
hmm,
everything. That is, I think, praiseworthy. Being able to build a second house after you've lost your
hmm,
first house.
hmm,
But again, it doesn't stop you from, again, complaining, saying, why did I lose my house in the first place?
hmm,
So it doesn't stop you from even holding yourself or the people themselves
hmm.
accountable. You have
Okay.
to say, like, I lost my house first. But it's like,
Hmm,
later on, you can pat yourself in the back and say, oh, good for me. I managed to get a second and third house.
hmm.
And then again, if you lost it that many times, there's no problem. So I think things in balance would be good.
But yeah.
All right. And speaking of, yeah, that was an interesting discussion. But before it becomes too long, I think we can move on to recommendations, where
Hmm.
we recommend things like books, songs, poetry, movies, or whatever that can help supplement, yeah, the discussion we just had. So, do you have anything for
Oh, yeah,
us
yeah, yeah.
regarding resilience? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Since you said that we should, well, okay, fine. I concede we should reserve our praise for large, socially, politically significant gestures of resilience.
Hmm.
Then I would recommend the movie The Darkest Hour, which
Is
was
it
great.
because Churchill was large?
No,
Sorry.
no, no, no.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
what Churchill did, well, portrayed
Mm-hmm.
by Gary Oldman, finally he got an award for wearing a fat suit. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, but what he portrayed there is the resilience of one man being aligned with the willingness of an entire country to be resilient like him. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that's I
Right.
think that's it's not only about Churchill being resilient. It's about him understanding that his resilience should be based on the resilience of others. So, but
Mm,
that's one. So that's a large, historically
large
significant. That's a historically significant
figure.
act. Well,
Yeah.
the crisis was, of course, severe. You have Nazi Germany invading, but one
Mm-hmm.
thing that I would like to take into account there is that the value of that act of resilience is not only based on the threat that Churchill faced from outside, but also the challenges he faced from those who would like to surrender.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. Resilience can only gain value if it is juxtaposed with those who are not willing to be resilient.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I don't see resilience in the Philippines as something praiseworthy. Not because it is useless, but because we already have it. Most of us have.
Mm, right.
You don't find people in the Philippines saying that we shouldn't be resilient. Again,
Mm,
because
okay.
it's not natural for human beings to surrender in the face of crisis. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's my recommendation. It's a good movie.
Right.
Nice cinematography.
Yeah, and a great performance by Gary Oldman, who won his first Oscar. Misha never surrender. I
Hatsu.
don't know. Yeah, he wore fat suit. It's not the best impression, but it moved me a bit. And you're right. It should motivate people, like a nation, not just him, his own. He
Mm,
translated his own resilience and, in a way, inspired the resilience of others.
mm,
So that's great. I love Churchill, by the way, and I have my own. You know, maybe I should say Churchill. Yeah. It's funny. Like I just, well, just to make seeing it. You know, uh, if you think about Yolanda, you know, uh, and say, okay, people are resilient, but have they rebuilt themselves? No, there's still ruins. You know, there are some buildings that are still collapsed. So, and they're still in the process of building back. So it's a long process. So you can't just judge them. So maybe you're right. We shouldn't praise resilience just yet. But one idea of resilience that is expressed in one form of, entertainment. So you use the movie. I think I'll use, well, maybe I'll cheat. Number one, the ages song, the rock song
mm,
Ulan, which I think is embedded in like our, like how the rain is a symbol for like tragedy,
mm,
like particularly ages is uh it's a band that is famous in being in beer gardens where people get drunk and then they sing about their heartbreak. Eto ako, basang-basa. So that's about a woman being drenched in the rain and just in a way talking about her heartache. And that's part of resilience. That's part of like being able to sing about it is actually a way of coping with suffering. But more important, I think, is the jukebox musical that was when they adapted the discography of
Mm.
Ages, Rock of Ages. My God, I don't know if it's out yet. I'll try to post a link to the discography, like the album. But it's a very interesting thing. It's a similar thing where the Filipino idea of resilience is being romanticized in the plot. Like
Mm.
literally, well, just to summarize the plot a bit, there's this barangay, community that was flooded by rain,
Mm.
and in the process, there's this protagonist girl who sang the song Ulan, and she became viral,
Mm.
and all of a sudden people began admiring her, and began, you know, uh, sharing and liking, and she became famous in the internet,
Mm.
and eventually people started seeing and like treating it like the museum of resilience. And then all of
Mm.
a sudden, when the news media all of a sudden wanted to interview her, all of a sudden the rainwater disappeared. And so the thing that made them famous, the thing that made disappeared. So I was like, that became a conundrum. So are they still worthy of being autographed, like like being interviewed now that the water is gone, the flood water is gone? So
Okay.
it's so witty. It's so smart and at the same time stupid. But well, this is only one of the many lessons I learned from watching it.
Mm.
If you're able to watch Rack of Ages, try to. It's one of the best, one of the smartest
Mm.
jukebox musicals I've ever watched. Actually, you were about to say something, yeah?
No, but I'll ask you regarding that one. No, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we mentioned earlier that the value of resilience would depend on the nature of the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Should resilience in the face of a crisis created by human beings be considered praiseworthy?
Mm. Mm.
Mm.
You're right.
That's one
It's
thing.
like,
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Filipinos see these typhoons more as you say, acts of God, and for that reason, they have no
Nature, yeah.
choice. They have no choice
Mm-hmm.
but to be resilient, and
Mm.
that's a veil covering the fact that such typhoons and its effects are partially based on human beings and their failures.
It's man-made.
It's
Right.
man-made, so yeah.
Right.
So should we praise resilience in the face of man-made failures?
Huh. It's like punching someone in the gut and say, and when they get up, oh, you're so strong.
Yeah.
You're so resilient. Here's another punch. So yeah, you're right. And resilience can make you be tough, but it also make you a punching bag. So
Yeah.
that's a very, very important point. All right, and that was a very interesting topic.
Yep.
Hopefully, it provided clarity in such a very
Short amount of
how do you say?
time.
Yeah, and a very contentious issue. And
Mm.
hopefully, we continue this discussion and reflect on our culture.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is episode 6 of the API podcast. Please, if you have comments, questions, violent reactions, you may email us at pipodcastph@gmail.com. You follow us on Spotify, Anchor, or YouTube, or whatever. All right.
Mm.
But until then,
Magandang gabi, mga ka-PI.
if you enjoy the jazzy tunes of this podcast, you can find similar works with John Victor Ordonez of the band John's Dirty Old Sneakers at Spotify and SoundCloud. The logo and design were done by Shin Miyamoto and Anthony Borja.